The courtroom was filled with an eerie silence, the kind that made every breath, every movement, feel like a disturbance in an otherwise frozen moment. The air was thick with anticipation, the weight of judgment pressing down on everyone present. At the center of it all sat Officer Caleb Johnson, his uniform crisp, his demeanor calm, almost too calm. His right hand rested firmly on the Bible, his eyes steady as he faced the judge. "Your Honor," he began, his voice unwavering, measured. "I saw her. Jessica Turner was at the crime scene. Her hands were covered in blood. She stood over the body, with the murder weapon." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The jury exchanged glances. The prosecution lawyer folded his arms, satisfied. It seemed like an open and shut case. A sworn officer of the law, with no apparent reason to lie, had just placed the defendant at the scene of a brutal crime. Across the room, Jessica Turner sat at the defense table, her posture rigid, her expression unreadable. But inside, her blood boiled. Fury, not fear, raced through her veins. She had spent years standing for justice, and now, she was the one being framed. What Johnson didn't know was that she wasn't just another unfortunate soul caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. She was an FBI agent, and she was not about to let a corrupt officer destroy her life with a fabricated story. Her attorney, Tom Reynolds, leaned toward her. "Stay calm," he whispered. "We'll break him." Jessica nodded, but her mind was already racing. How had it come to this? How had she, a respected federal agent, found herself in the defendant's chair, fighting for her freedom? The answer was simple. Caleb Johnson was more than just a dishonest cop. He was part of something bigger, something rotten, a criminal network that had been operating in the shadows, feeding off the very system meant to protect the innocent. And Jessica, she was the one person who had gotten too close to the truth. She had spent months investigating officers like Johnson, officers who had traded their duty for dirty money, who had planted evidence, manipulated testimonies, and covered up crimes in exchange for power and profit. She had been building a case, piecing together the web of corruption, preparing to expose them all. And that was when they struck first. They framed her, turned the system she had sworn to uphold against her, and painted her as a murderer. Now, she sat on trial, her reputation in ruins, her future on the line. But Jessica Turner was no ordinary defendant. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for the truth. The judge cleared his throat, bringing the room back to focus. "Miss Turner, you will have your opportunity to respond. But for now, we will proceed with the witness testimony." Jessica folded her hands in her lap, her fingers curling slightly into fists. She knew Johnson was lying. She could see it in the way he avoided looking directly at her, in the slight tension in his jaw. He was good, trained, practiced. But he had underestimated her. Her attorney stood. "Your Honor, may I ask the witness a few questions before we continue?" The judge nodded. "Proceed." Reynolds stepped forward, his voice calm, deliberate. "Officer Johnson, you say you saw Miss Turner at the crime scene, correct?" Johnson nodded. "That's correct. And you recall her standing over the body, covered in blood?" "Yes." Reynolds took a step closer. "Tell me, Officer Johnson, what was she wearing?" A pause. A flicker of hesitation. I don't remember exactly," Johnson said, clearing his throat. "It was dark. Everything happened quickly." Jessica's lips curled into a slight smirk. That was his first mistake. A good liar never hesitates. Reynolds pressed on. "So, you remember seeing her clearly enough to identify her face, to see blood on her hands, to witness her standing over a dead body. But you can't recall what she was wearing?" Johnson's jaw tightened. "Like I said, it was dark." "Dark," Reynolds repeated. "And yet you were sure enough to swear under oath that it was her." The room was silent. Even the prosecution shifted uncomfortably. Jessica knew the battle had just begun, but she had already found the first crack in Johnson's carefully constructed lie, and she was going to tear it wide open. "Now, let me ask you, if you were in Jessica's shoes, would you fight back? Would you stand against the lies? Let me know in the comments below. And if you believe that the truth should always prevail, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Because justice isn't just a word, It's a fight. Jessica Turner had dedicated her life to justice. She had spent years tracking down criminals, uncovering their darkest secrets, and ensuring they faced the full force of the law. Her work had earned her respect among her colleagues and fear among those who operated in the shadows. She believed in the system, in the idea that the truth would always prevail, that the innocent would be protected, and that the guilty would be punished. But that belief was shattered the day the system turned against her. It started as a routine case, one that initially seemed like just another investigation. A tip led Jessica to a string of suspicious activities tied to a group of officers within the department. As she dug deeper, the pieces began to form a horrifying picture, a network of corrupt cops operating hand in hand with powerful criminals. Evidence tampering, bribery, cover-ups of serious crimes. It was a well-oiled machine, one that had been running unnoticed for years. And Jessica, in her relentless pursuit of justice, had gotten too close to dismantling it. Among them was Officer Caleb Johnson, a man who had built his career on deception. He wasn't just a corrupt officer. He was one of the masterminds behind the entire operation. He had spent years building relationships in law enforcement, cultivating trust, while secretly orchestrating illegal deals behind the scenes. He knew how to play the system, how to manipulate the truth, and how to eliminate threats before they could expose him. And Jessica, with her determination and sharp instincts, had become a very real threat. Johnson knew that if she continued her investigation, everything he had built would crumble. She was too close. She had connected the dots, uncovered too much, and it was only a matter of time before she had the proof she needed to bring them all down. He couldn't let that happen. And so, he did what he did best. He took control of the narrative before she could. The plan was seamless. A body was found, murdered in cold blood. The crime scene was carefully staged, with just enough evidence planted to implicate Jessica. A fabricated witness account placed her at the scene, and with the justice system already programmed to trust law enforcement, the setup was nearly flawless. Who would believe her over a decorated officer like Johnson? The moment she was accused, her years of service, her dedication to truth and justice, meant nothing. The people she had worked alongside, the institution she had devoted her life to, turned its back on her in an instant. Jessica had been on the other side of cases like this before. She had seen innocent people framed, evidence manipulated, and witnesses coerced. But she had always believed that in the end, justice would prevail. Now she was the one in the crosshairs, and she knew firsthand how impossible it was to fight against a system designed to silence the truth. The weight of it all pressed down on her, suffocating, relentless. And yet, in the midst of the betrayal and injustice, one thing burned stronger than anything else: her resolve. They thought she would crumble, that she would accept her fate, that the walls closing in on her would break her spirit. But they had underestimated her. Jessica had spent her entire career outmaneuvering criminals, dismantling their operations, and exposing their lies. She wasn't just any defendant. She was an FBI agent, trained to find the truth, to think ahead, to anticipate moves before they happened. And she wasn't just going to fight. She was going to expose them all. She had no choice but to play the long game. She had to stay calm, act as though she were just another victim of the system, while quietly preparing her next move. She needed to gather the evidence that would prove her innocence, and more importantly, uncover the full extent of the corruption she had been investigating. She knew that Johnson and his associates had grown comfortable in their power, believing themselves untouchable. But that confidence would be their downfall. The real challenge was time. She had to work quickly, but carefully. She had to find the weak link in Johnson's network, the person who would break under pressure, the evidence that couldn't be refuted. She had to think like them, anticipate their next move, and stay one step ahead. It was a dangerous game, but Jessica was no stranger to danger. She had walked into the lion's den before and come out stronger. This time would be no different. As she sat in that courtroom, watching Johnson deliver his lies with confidence, she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for every innocent person who had ever been framed, for every victim who had been silenced by corruption. She was fighting for the truth, and she was going to win. Jessica's attorney, Tom Reynolds, rose from his chair, adjusting his tie as he approached the witness stand. His steps were measured, deliberate, every movement designed to exert quiet pressure. The room was still, the air thick with anticipation. The jury's eyes shifted between him and Officer Caleb Johnson, who sat rigidly, his hands clasped together as though holding onto his composure for dear life. "Officer Johnson," Reynolds began, his voice steady but firm, "you claim to have seen my client, Jessica Turner, at the crime scene. Can you describe what she was wearing that night?" There was a pause. A flicker of hesitation crossed Johnson's face. It was brief, but undeniable. He shifted in his seat. It was dark," he muttered. "Things happened fast." Jessica caught the micro-expression, the subtle darting of his eyes, the slight tremble in his fingers as he clenched them tighter. She knew the signs. He was grasping for a way out, a way to make his statement seem credible without locking himself into specifics that could be disproven. Reynolds nodded, as if expecting that answer. "So, just to clarify, Officer Johnson, you claim you saw my client standing over the body, covered in blood, holding the murder weapon. But now you're saying you can't recall a single detail about what she was wearing." A tense silence settled over the courtroom. The jury exchanged glances. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Even the judge seemed to lean forward, as if suddenly more invested in what was unfolding before him. I remember her being there," Johnson stammered, his previous confidence wavering. "I remember her hands, the blood, but I didn't focus on the clothes. It was chaotic." Reynolds took another step forward. "Chaotic," he repeated, rolling the word around as if testing its weight. "And yet, you were sure enough to swear under oath that it was her, that you saw her well enough to make that call." Johnson swallowed hard. Yes. Jessica's smirk was barely contained. She had dealt with criminals who were better liars than this. He was unraveling. Reynolds turned to the jury, allowing the moment to sink in before he continued. "Ladies and gentlemen, Officer Johnson has just admitted that he does not recall the clothing of the person he claims to have seen. This is a crucial detail, because we know that memory is a fragile thing. If he cannot remember something as simple as clothing, how can we trust that he truly remembers the identity of the person he saw?" The seed of doubt had been planted. The prosecutor quickly stood. "Objection, Your Honor. The officer has testified to the identity of the defendant based on facial recognition, not clothing." The judge raised a hand, silencing the room before shifting his gaze to Reynolds. "I'll allow it. But tread carefully, Mr. Reynolds." Reynolds nodded and turned back to Johnson. "Officer, let me ask you this. When you arrived at the scene, were you wearing your body camera?" Another hesitation. Another moment of discomfort. It wasn't turned on," Johnson admitted. "There was a malfunction." Reynolds arched an eyebrow. "A malfunction. Convenient. Tell me, Officer Johnson, how often do body cameras malfunction?" Johnson hesitated again. "Not often," he conceded. "But it happens." Reynolds nodded, pacing slightly. "And you're telling this jury that on the very night in question, the night when you supposedly witnessed my client at the crime scene, your body camera just happened to fail?" Johnson exhaled sharply. "Yes." Jessica's heart pounded. She could feel the room shifting, the energy tilting in her favor. The jury was beginning to see the cracks in Johnson's story, the inconsistencies stacking up like a house of cards ready to collapse. Reynolds walked to the defense table, picked up a document, and returned to Johnson. "Officer Johnson, do you recall filing this report the night of the murder?" Johnson's eyes flickered to the paper. He nodded. "Yes." Reynolds held it up. "In this report, you described the suspect as having short hair. Is that correct?" "Yes." Reynolds turned to Jessica, who sat calmly at the defense table, her long brown hair cascading past her shoulders. He let the visual speak for itself before addressing the jury. "My client has never had short hair," Reynolds stated, his voice calm but firm. "Not before the night of the murder, not after. And yet, Officer Johnson filed a report stating the suspect did. Now, was this another malfunction of memory, Officer Johnson?" Johnson's face paled. He opened his mouth, then closed it, unable to formulate a response. Reynolds turned back to the jury, his voice steady. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are here to seek the truth. And truth, as we all know, doesn't falter under scrutiny. Lies, however, lies crumble. Jessica sat back in her chair, satisfaction settling in. The battle had just begun, but the cracks were forming. And once those cracks grew wide enough, the entire case against her would come crashing down. Reynolds wasn't done. He turned back to the judge, his voice unwavering. "Your Honor, we request security footage from the crime scene." The judge nodded. "Granted. Let's proceed." The courtroom fell into a hush as the lights dimmed slightly and the footage flickered onto the screen. The timestamp was unmistakable. Jessica Turner was nowhere near the crime scene at the time of the murder. The video showed her walking into her office miles away, entering the building at the exact moment Officer Johnson claimed to have seen her standing over a dead body. The silence in the room deepened. A few jurors shifted in their seats. Even the prosecutor leaned forward, watching intently. Reynolds let the moment hang in the air before he turned back to Johnson, his expression sharp. "How is that possible, Officer Johnson?" Johnson's face paled. His mouth opened, then closed. He licked his lips, searching for an answer. The footage, it could have been tampered with. Jessica finally stood. She didn't need permission. Her voice was calm, but carried through the room like steel. "We had this footage verified by multiple independent experts. It's real. And more importantly, it's not the only evidence we have." Reynolds took a step toward the prosecution's table, pulling out a folder. "Your Honor, I submit forensic evidence collected from the crime scene." He handed the documents to the bailiff, who brought them to the judge. "These reports confirm that the fingerprints on the murder weapon do not belong to my client. They belong to someone else." The judge studied the documents. "Whose fingerprints were found?" Reynolds turned, his gaze locked onto Johnson, a fellow officer, one of Johnson's known associates, Officer Richard Gaines. A murmur spread through the courtroom. Johnson's grip on the stand tightened. His collar suddenly seemed too tight. He was trapped, and he knew it. The prosecutor, clearly unsettled, stood. "Objection, Your Honor. This evidence." The judge held up a hand. "Objection overruled. Continue, Mr. Reynolds." Reynolds nodded and walked slowly toward the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have Officer Johnson placing my client at the crime scene, despite undeniable proof that she was miles away. We have forensic evidence directly contradicting his testimony. And now, we have fingerprints linking another officer, a known colleague of his, to the murder weapon." He turned back to Johnson. "So, Officer Johnson, I ask again, how is that possible?" Johnson's jaw tightened. His fingers drummed against the witness stand. He was losing control of the narrative. His carefully constructed lie was unraveling before everyone's eyes. Reynolds wasn't finished. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out an audio recording device. "And one more thing, Your Honor. We have a recording." The judge raised a brow. "A recording of what?" Reynolds pressed play. A grainy voice filled the room. "Jessica Turner is getting too close. We have to make sure she takes the fall. We'll plant the evidence. And Johnson, you just make sure your statement holds." The blood drained from Johnson's face. The jury looked stunned. The entire courtroom was frozen in shock. Jessica sat back down, her heart pounding. The truth was out in the open now. The lies had been exposed. And Officer Caleb Johnson was running out of options. The courtroom was deathly silent as the prosecution stood, holding a set of documents in one hand. The lead prosecutor cleared his throat and turned to face the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "we have obtained conclusive forensic evidence that fundamentally alters the foundation of this case." He turned to the bailiff, who handed a folder to the judge. "The blood found on the murder weapon does not belong to Jessica Turner." He let the words sink in, pausing just long enough for their full impact to take hold. A ripple of murmurs spread through the room. Jessica sat motionless, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "The DNA found on the weapon belongs to another individual," the prosecutor continued, flipping a page. "A police officer. More specifically, Officer Richard Gaines." At the mention of the name, gasps filled the courtroom. Jessica turned her head slightly, catching the expression of Caleb Johnson, whose face had gone rigid. Reynolds leaned forward, his voice unwavering. Officer Gaines is a known associate of Officer Johnson. And yet, we are to believe that Jessica Turner committed this crime while the DNA evidence tells a different story entirely. He turned toward the jury. This is not a coincidence. Jessica exhaled slowly. The case against her was unraveling, and Johnson knew it. Before Johnson could react, the prosecution dealt the final blow. "Your Honor," the prosecutor said, holding up a small audio recorder. "The court must hear this." The judge hesitated for a brief moment before giving a nod. "Proceed." The prosecutor pressed play, and within seconds, the voices of Johnson and Gaines filled the courtroom. "Jessica Turner is getting too close," a deep voice muttered. "She's been digging around too much. We need to make sure she takes the fall." "We'll plant the evidence," another voice responded. "You just need to make sure your testimony holds up." Johnson shifted in his chair, his jaw tightening as the weight of the recording settled over the room like a suffocating fog. The silence that followed was deafening. Jessica felt her heart pounding. She had suspected there was more to this setup, but hearing their words out loud, hearing the callousness in their voices, solidified everything. The jury looked visibly shaken. The judge's expression hardened. Even the prosecutor, who had maintained a professional detachment, now spoke with an edge to his voice. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "this recording speaks for itself. The plot to frame Jessica Turner was deliberate. It was planned, and it involved men who were supposed to uphold the law." Jessica swallowed, watching as Johnson's confidence finally cracked. His face was pale, beads of sweat forming at his temple. Reynolds rose from his chair and walked toward the jury. His voice was quiet, controlled, yet firm. "Corruption festers in the shadows. It hides behind badges and uniforms, behind sworn oaths and false testimony. But eventually the truth comes to light. And when it does, justice prevails." The courtroom erupted. Spectators whispered to one another. The judge pounded his gavel, calling for order. But the damage was done. The illusion had shattered. Jessica was innocent. And Johnson? He was part of something much bigger, something darker. A corrupt empire built on deception and lies. And that empire was beginning to crumble. The verdict came swiftly. The judge's gavel struck the wooden bench with finality, and the words Jessica had waited so long to hear rang through the tense courtroom. "Not guilty." A wave of relief washed over her, but it was accompanied by something heavier, something she hadn't expected. She had won, yet it didn't feel like a victory. The system she had spent her career believing in had tried to crush her. It had nearly succeeded. Officer Johnson sat motionless at the defense table, his face drained of color. The once confident officer, who had lied so effortlessly under oath, now looked like a man grasping at the final moments of his crumbling world. One by one, his fellow conspirators were taken into custody. The corruption that had once thrived in the shadows had been dragged into the light. Jessica gathered her belongings, the weight of the trial still pressing down on her shoulders. As she stepped outside the courthouse, the cool air hit her face, but it did little to ease the tightness in her chest. Reporters swarmed, microphones thrust in her direction, voices demanding statements. She ignored them, weaving through the crowd until she found a quiet space on the courthouse steps. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, her eyes scanning the screen. A message from her FBI partner, someone who had never stopped believing in her innocence. "We're not done yet. Keep fighting." She let out a slow breath. The battle for her freedom was over, but the war against corruption was far from finished. For every Johnson exposed, there were countless others still hiding in plain sight, wearing badges, swearing oaths, upholding a system that too often protected its own at the cost of the innocent. She had seen firsthand how quickly the law could be twisted, how easily a good person could be painted as a criminal. It made her wonder, how many others had been wrongfully convicted? How many innocent people sat behind bars because of men like Johnson? Jessica had spent years believing that the justice system, while flawed, ultimately worked. But now that belief was shaken. And yet, despite everything, she knew she couldn't walk away. She had been given a second chance. Now it was her responsibility to fight for those who didn't have one. As she descended the courthouse steps, her mind was already racing. This case had nearly destroyed her, but it had also exposed something bigger. She wasn't just going to move on. She was going to expose every piece of corruption she could find. Her name had been cleared, but her mission was just beginning. Have you ever faced a situation where you had to fight for the truth, even when the odds were stacked against you? Share your story in the comments below. And if you believe justice should always win, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Together, we can shine a light on the truth.